Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to tackle some of life's biggest questions by looking closely at, well, a whole bunch of source material. Today, it's something huge, something that shapes almost everything. Justice. What is justice? Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? We all kind of feel like we know fairness when we see it. But dig just a little deeper, and wow, it gets complicated fast. It becomes this tangled, sometimes really difficult dilemma. What's the truly right thing to do? Not just for us, but, for everyone. And how does that connect to a meaningful life?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're aiming for in this deep dive. We want to explore this whole idea of justice through some, really different philosophical eyes. We're talking utilitarianism, the greatest good idea, then libertarianism, all about freedom, Kant's universal rules, Rawls' fairness behind that veil of ignorance, and even Aristotle's thoughts on virtue and purpose. We've gone through a lot of articles, cases, the original texts, and the goal is to pull out those key insights, maybe some surprising facts, things that might genuinely make you rethink not just fairness, but maybe even what gives your own life meaning and purpose.
And yeah, we've got some scenarios lined up that will really make you think. These aren't just like abstract puzzles. They're designed to hit you right in the gut, challenge your instincts. Get ready to ask yourself, seriously, what would I do here? And what does that answer tell me about what I really value? Okay, let's kick off with utilitarianism. People like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. This one feels pretty straightforward sometimes. The basic idea is maximizing happiness or well-being, the greatest good for the greatest number. If doing something leads to more overall happiness, well, that's the right thing to do. Simple, right. So picture this, the classic. You're driving a train, it's out of control, heading for 5 workers on the track that can't get out of the way. Doing nothing means they all die. But there's a lever, pull it, and the train switches to another track. Problem is, there's 1 worker on that track. Save 5, sacrifice 1. What's the immediate utilitarian call?
Well, yeah, faced with that, the standard trolley problem, most people say they'd pull the lever. The utilitarian math seems, pretty clear. 5 lives are more than 1 life. It fits right into that principle. Maximize the good outcome, reduce the suffering. It's about the numbers, the consequences.
Okay, but now it gets interesting. Let's tweak it just a bit. You're not the driver anymore. You're standing on a bridge overlooking the track. Same train, same 5 workers heading for disaster. No lever this time. But next to you, there's let's say a very large person. If you were to push that person off the bridge, their weight would stop the train. You'd save the 5. The math is the same, isn't it? 5 lives for 1.
Yeah.
But suddenly, pushing feels very different. Why is that?
That hesitation, that feeling, it really gets to a core issue with utilitarianism. It shows that maybe justice isn't just about counting lives, especially when you have to be the one to directly physically cause harm. Pushing someone feels different than pulling a lever. It's active, it's personal. What's fascinating is how our gut feelings, our moral intuitions kind of push back against that pure numbers game.
Yeah.
It suggests the way you achieve the outcome matters. Even Mill, a key utilitarian, saw this complexity. He talked about higher versus lower pleasures, suggesting some kinds of happiness, like intellectual or moral ones, might be worth more. It's not just simple addition.
Right, that adds some nuance. But even so, focusing only on the greater good, the outcome, it can lead down some really dark paths, can't it? Like imagine a ticking bomb scenario. A terrorist has planted a nuclear device. It's going to kill millions. They're caught but won't talk. Does utilitarianism say, well, do you torture the terrorist to get the location if it saves millions? And then the awful extension. What if torture doesn't work? What if the only way is to, God forbid, torture their innocent child in front of them? The save them any logic gets terrifying there.
And that's exactly where the strongest criticisms hit utilitarianism hard. That relentless focus on consequences can, in these extreme cases, seem to justify actions that most of us would find morally reprehensible. Acts that violate basic human rights, basic dignity, the line between acceptable sacrifice and just horror. It gets incredibly blurry. It forces that awful question. Do the ends always justify the means? Especially when innocent life is treated as just a variable in the calculation. That challenges our whole sense of compassion.
And this isn't just theoretical. There's that real-life case. Dudley and Stevens back in 1884. 4 English sailors shipwrecked, adrift for weeks, no food, no water. One of them, a young cabin boy, was very sick, likely dying anyway from drinking seawater. The other 3, facing certain death themselves, made the horrific decision to kill him and eat him to survive. They were rescued later, but then charged with murder. Utilitarianism might say, well, 3 lives saved for 1 lost. Should they have been convicted?
That case is just a brutal, real-world example of this exact clash. Utilitarian thinking, survival of the majority, ran headfirst into a deeply held moral rule. Murder is wrong. Full stop.
Yep.
The court actually did convict them of murder. Though, interestingly, public sympathy was high given the circumstances, and their sentences were reduced to only 6 months. It really shows that tension between strict law, moral absolutes, and, well, human desperation and empathy. Justice is rarely simple.
Okay, let's switch gears completely. What if we put the individual first? Their freedom, their rights, above almost all else. That takes us into the realm of libertarianism. Thinkers like John Locke are key here.
Right. For libertarians, the fundamental idea is self-ownership. You own yourself, your body, your labor. So, you should have the maximum freedom to choose what you do with your life and your property as long as you're not hurting others or taking their stuff. The government's job, minimal. Protect contracts, stop force and fraud, but stay out of personal choices. That includes things like deciding not to wear a seatbelt, or even really controversial stuff like, say, selling a kidney or other consensual acts between adults. It's all about individual liberty and minimal coercion. Each person defines their own good.
So how does that work when these individual freedoms bump up against really complex emotional situations, like the Baby M case back in the 80s? A surrogacy contract, a couple hires a woman to carry a baby for them. She has the baby, but then forms this incredibly strong bond and decides she wants to keep the child, breaking the contract.
Well, from a strict libertarian view, a contract is a contract. It was a voluntary agreement between adults, so it should be enforced. Individual autonomy, the freedom to make agreements, is paramount. But as that case showed so clearly, it's not always that simple, is it? You had contractual freedom clashing head-on with powerful maternal bonds, something many see as almost an inherent right. And the court's decision reflected that complexity. They upheld the contract, giving custody to the father, but they also granted the surrogate mother visitation rights, acknowledging her connection. It wasn't a pure libertarian outcome. It shows how the law often tries to balance these competing values that go beyond just the letter of an agreement. Life's messy.
And what about acts of individual conscience against big institutions, like Edward Snowden? He leaked classified government surveillance documents, risked everything based on his belief that what the government was doing was wrong, that rights were being violated.
Yeah, from a libertarian angle, you could certainly see his actions as courageous, standing up for individual rights, for transparency, against potential government overreach, speaking truth to power. But it also immediately throws up those tricky questions about limits. Does one person's view of the truth, or the public's supposed right to know, justify potentially compromising national security or causing chaos? It really highlights that tension between absolute individual freedom and, well, collective safety or order. How do you balance one person's actions against the potential impact on many?
Okay, let's pivot again. A totally different way to think about justice comes from Immanuel Kant. For Kant, it's not about outcomes, not about happiness, not even really about individual freedom in the libertarian sense. It's about duty. Universal moral laws. He had this idea called a categorical imperative, basically a rule you must follow, period, no exceptions.
Yeah.
Like his famous example, lying is always wrong. Why? Because if everyone lied whenever it was convenient, the whole concept of trust would just collapse. Society couldn't function. It's about the universal principle, not the specific result.
That's the key difference, yes. Kant is all about reason and universality. These moral laws aren't based on feelings or consequences. They come from pure reason itself. And another crucial part of his categorical imperative is this. Always treat people, yourself included, as ends in themselves, never just as a means to an end. This directly contradicts some of those utilitarian scenarios, right, where you might sacrifice one person for the sake of many. For Kant, using someone like that as a mere tool is fundamentally wrong, no matter how good the intended outcome might seem. Every person has inherent dignity.
Which leads to some really tough conclusions. Kant's own famous example.
Oh.
A murderer knocks on your door, asks if your friend is hiding inside. Your friend is hiding inside, Kant says. You have to tell the truth. Because lying violates that universal moral law, even if it leads to your friend's death. How do most people react to that?
Well, that's often where people find Kant's view incredibly rigid, maybe even inhuman. The principle of truthfulness is vital, sure. But faced with that choice, most people would lie to save their friend's life. It really highlights the potential conflict between absolute moral rules and, well, compassion or the immediate need to prevent harm. It makes you question if any rule can truly be absolute in every conceivable situation.
So if we're thinking about designing a just society, not just individual actions, that brings us to John Rawls and his really influential idea, justice as fairness, which he explored through this amazing thought experiment, the veil of ignorance.
The veil of ignorance. Yeah, it's a powerful idea. Rawls asks us to imagine we're choosing the basic principles for our society, but we do it from behind this veil. Behind it, you don't know anything about who you'll be in that society. You don't know your race, your class, your talents, your gender, your health. Nothing. Rawls argued that in that state of ignorance, rationally, you'd choose principles that protect everyone, especially the worst off. Why? Because you might end up being one of the worst off. So you'd likely choose things like basic liberties for all and social and economic arrangements that benefit the least advantaged, maybe through taxes and social programs. It ensures a baseline of fairness and dignity no matter where you land.
So Rawls is really trying to find that sweet spot, isn't he? Balancing individual freedom with a commitment to equality and fairness. Making sure everyone has a fair shot, a basic level of opportunity and respect, which seems essential for a meaningful life within society.
Exactly. It's a compelling way to think about impartial justice. Of course, the critique is always there. Can we really imagine ourselves behind such a veil? Can we truly shed all our biases, even hypothetically? It's maybe more of a thought tool than a perfect practical guide, but it forces us to think about fairness from a perspective other than our own immediate self-interest. It demands empathy.
Okay, one more major perspective. Aristotle and virtue ethics. This feels quite different again. For Aristotle, justice isn't primarily about rules or rights or even outcomes. It's about character. It's about living a life of purpose, developing virtues, and being an active, engaged citizen for the common good. Justice is tied up in living a flourishing, meaningful human life.
Yeah, Aristotle's approach is deeply connected to purpose, or telos. His famous example is about a rare, beautiful flute. Who deserves it? Not necessarily the richest person, or the person who happens to find it. Aristotle says the most just thing is to give it to the best flute player. Why? Because the flute's purpose is to be played well, to create beautiful music. Giving it to the best player fulfills that purpose, contributing excellence to the community. More broadly, justice for Aristotle is a virtue you cultivate through practice, through habit, especially through participating in civic life. By deliberating together about what's good for the community, citizens don't just make decisions, they actually become better, more virtuous people. This fosters a society where everyone can strive towards their potential and find meaning in contributing to the whole.
That idea of purpose and common good is really powerful. But we keep hitting the same wall, don't we? What happens when that common good, or a utilitarian calculation, or even a universal rule clashes with our most basic individual rights, or our deepest personal connections? Let's go back to the trolley problem just one last time.
Right.
But make it personal. The train is heading for 5 strangers. You can pull the lever to switch it to sidetrack, but the one person on the sidetrack is your child. Now what? What does that raw feeling tell you?
Oh, that just lays it bare, doesn't it? How profoundly our personal relationships complicate everything. Those abstract principles, save the many, follow the rule, they often just dissolve under that kind of emotional pressure. It shows our morality isn't just logic, it's deeply tied to love, loyalty, our human connections. It forces us to ask incredibly hard questions about impartiality versus our fundamental nature. What kind of person are we if we can make that choice?
Or think about a modern medical crisis.
Yeah.
A hospital, 1 ventilator left. 2 patients needed critically. One is young, healthy otherwise, potentially decades of life ahead. The other is an older doctor, maybe saved hundreds of lives already, a respected community figure. Who gets the ventilator?
Gosh, that's just a convergence of all these dilemmas. Utilitarianism might look at potential future life years favoring the young person. Libertarianism, maybe first come, first served. Or a lottery, respecting individual claims equally, perhaps. Kant would demand a consistent, universal principle, maybe age, maybe prognosis, but applied without favor. Aristotle might ask about purpose and contribution, the doctor's skills versus the young person's potential. There's just no single right answer that satisfies all perspectives. Each choice reflects a different core value, potential versus past contribution, fairness versus utility. These choices shape who we are as a society.
And one last really grim one. The overcrowded lifeboat. The boat is sinking. It can only hold 10, but there are 12 people. 2 people have to go overboard to save the other 10. How on earth do you choose? Weakest, oldest, draw straws. What does justice even mean then? How do you find meaning in that choice?
That scenario forces us right down to survival ethics. You could argue, maybe like Aristotle, about who contributes most to the group's survival, thinking about utility or fitness. Or you could demand, like Rawls might suggest, a fair process, like drawing lots, precisely because any other choice seems unbearable, arbitrary. It just highlights the brutal reality when principles meet impossible choices. Even in the worst moments, we're still trying to find a just way, a way that reflects some core value, some sense of human dignity, even if it's just in the fairness of the process. That search itself might be where meaning lies.
So what this deep dive really seems to show is that justice, it's not one thing. It's not a simple formula. It's this constant push and pull, isn't it? A tension between competing ideas, competing values that challenge us constantly.
Absolutely. Utilitarianism aims for the best outcome for the most people, but it risks trampling individuals. Libertarianism celebrates freedom above all, but might ignore deep inequalities or collective needs. Kant gives us clear moral rules, these absolutes, but they can feel inflexible, sometimes even cruel in complex situations. Rawls tries to balance liberty and equality through fairness, but achieving true impartiality is a huge challenge. And Aristotle calls us to be virtuous citizens focused on purpose and the common good, which demands a lot from us personally and collectively.
So in the end, maybe justice isn't some destination we finally reach. Maybe it's the ongoing conversation, the struggle itself, the constant effort to figure out how to balance happiness, freedom, fairness, and virtue in our own lives and in the world we build together. That struggle, that questioning, maybe that's what gives our search for justice and perhaps our lives real depth and meaning. So as you think about all this, about these philosophies and these tough choices, ask yourself, what would I really do in those situations? What does my gut tell me? What does my reason argue for? Your answer, maybe even your uncertainty, might just point towards your own personal philosophy of justice and what truly matters most in your journey through life.